Okay, hi everyone, welcome. We're at 2 minutes past. I'll maybe give it another minute to allow for more people to join, and then we'll get started. So bear with us, 1 minute. Okay, so I think 3 minutes is reasonable to allow people to jump off their previous calls. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to FNA's 14th CBDC broadcast now. As always, thank you for joining. Thank you for supporting these events this year and last. So I'm Anthony Harrison. I look after marketing here at FNA. We've got two fantastic guests for you today from the BIS and Accenture. I'll cover some very quick housekeeping, couple of minutes, and then I'll hand you over to them and our host, Carlos, to begin the discussion. So by way of quick housekeeping, this broadcast follows a standard 60-minute format in which our guests will provide insight into the latest developments, innovations, influence in the sector, and topics surrounding CBDCs. We always try and have 5-10 minutes at the end of it for a Q&A with the guests. So if you'd like to ask a question, I just ask, please don't use the chat functionality at the bottom of the screen. It makes questions a lot harder to track. If you could use the Q&A widget, which again is at the bottom of the screen, use that, and then our guests will aim to answer as many of them as they can at the Q&A at the end of the session. Next slide, please. So for those who perhaps aren't as familiar with FNA, this might be your first session. I'll just very quickly explain what we do. So we are an advanced analytics and simulation technology company. So we work across 4 core sectors, namely central banks, commercial banks, FMIs, and national security organizations. Next slide, please. So this slide actually digs down a little further into our CBDC lifecycle solution, which of course is fairly relevant to this session. The background, I guess, is that with 90 plus central banks now looking to introduce a digital currency in the near future, there are still a lot of related questions to CBDCs that do remain unanswered, related, I guess, to the impact and also the success of CBDCs, which are still relatively unknown. We know that they're coming. We can see as we progress through a lot of these live pilots and rollouts, we're definitely going to see a lot more news come out, results and data coming from them soon. So built in partnership with G&D, our CBDC lifecycle solution delivers a very flexible agent-based model of any payment ecosystem. This then enables regulators and financial system participants to then rapidly test, model, and then simulate the economic and financial stability implications of introducing and then managing a CBDC. So this allows them to monitor, improve, and also analyze them post-launch as well. So it's a pre-launch and post-launch solution. For FNA, we absolutely believe that it's essential to understand the impact of a CBDC through simulation technology before the rollout, so during the design and research phase, and then also once it's rolled out as well in post-launch. So if you've got any questions about that, there are details on the last slide at the end of the session, but I will now hand you over to Dr. Carlos Leon, who works here as Director of FMI and Digital Currency Solutions. For those of you who have joined our previous sessions, you'll certainly recognize him. Carlos will introduce our 2 speakers today, and then we'll get on with the discussion. So Carlos, thank you, over to you.
Thank you, Anthony. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on the part of the globe you are. Today, as Anthony mentioned, we're going to have 2 prime guest speakers, Daniel Eidan and Ousmène Mandeng. Daniel is an advisor and solution architect at the Bank for International Settlements in the Innovation Hub, where he builds technology solutions for the central bank community with a special focus on blockchain and CBDC. Welcome, Daniel. Thank you for joining us. And Ousmène, Ousmène is Senior Advisor, Global Blockchain Technology at Accenture. Ousmène focuses on strategy and economics of payment innovations. He's a senior advisor and lead of economic and financial strategy with Accenture's blockchain and multi-party systems, and co-leads Accenture's campaign globally for the dissemination of central bank digital currencies and thought leadership on the wider implication of the digital transformation in payments. Ousmène, thank you very much for joining us. Anything you want to declare before we start, Daniel and Ousmène?
No, thanks for having me. I guess I will just stay up front before I forget that I speak on my own behalf and not on behalf of the Bank for International Settlements.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you both. That's what the declarations are about, to make everything clear what we're going to speak and on what behalf of who or which institution we're going to talk from. So today's broadcast, it has to do with a very, very hot topic nowadays, which has to do with mBridge. So just to give you an overview of today's session, we know that cross-border payments are traditionally regarded as slow, expensive, and rather opaque. So our topic today is how is the Bank for International Settlements proposing to overcome these challenges through a multi-CBDC platform based on DLT technology. This CBDC broadcast, in which we have Daniel and we have Ousmène as our guest speakers, we're going to discuss Project mBridge, which aims to solve those challenges associated with cross-border payments through a CBDC platform based on new blockchain technology, which has been custom designed and developed by central banks for central banks. So it's a very particular solution. This platform aim is to facilitate inexpensive, real-time, peer-to-peer cross-border payments and foreign exchange transaction using multiple CBDCs while ensuring compliance with regulations set by each one of those jurisdictions. So that's like my way of summarizing what we're going to talk about. Once again, thank you, Daniel and Ousmène, for joining us. So I'm going to start with Daniel. First question is, what were the key objectives and success criteria of the Project mBridge pilot, and how were those achieved?
Okay, thank you, Carlos. I'll do my best. I'll do my best to address that. I think if I zoom out a little bit for the objectives in general for the Innovation Hub, is to experiment in a very kind of hands-on and tactical way with central banking applications and things in the technology world that are relevant to central bankers, and to lead the conversations and to take outputs of our experiments and provide them as inputs into policymakers and decision makers' agendas and perspective. If I think about kind of the cycle of innovation, I think we think about three main things that need to be, that we probably sit at the intersection of all three of these main things, independent of the actual project. And that's desirability of a solution, feasibility of the solution, and viability of the solution. The desirability means, does the industry actually want it? Is there desire for it to come to fruition? Feasibility is it technically achievable? When I say technically, that's not necessarily just at a technology level. It's also in terms of legal and policy and many other things like that. And then lastly, the viability of solution, assuming that we have the desirability and the feasibility, is it a viable solution in terms of coming to the market? What's the competition model? What are the incentives? How can it get adopted? How can it be operated? Things like that. So with that kind of, with those three attributes in mind, zooming in onto the mBridge project, I think in general, the desirability of improving cross-border payments is well known, specifically in the region that the mBridge is operating in. The purpose of the experiment was really to look at the feasibility and lean a little bit into the viability of the model. So primarily is to see, can we build a technical platform, and can that technical platform operate in a real world environment, with considerations into, well, if the answer to this is yes, we need to align the viability of the business models and the participation and things like that. So the feasibility of the experiment and the pilot of mBridge was really to look at the role of central bank money facilitating peer-to-peer cross-border payments between wholesale market participants, where the payment itself is all done in domestic local currencies. So we're looking at bilateral currency pairs for the transactions. And of course, this is all done on a common platform, meaning that there's a common settlement that is provided to all the participants on the mBridge platform, where that's in contrast to today, where most of the cross-border payments aren't done in central bank money. They don't have a common settlement. They're settled in disparate systems. And of course, the transactions aren't necessarily peer-to-peer. They're very much dependent on the correspondent banking relationships of the banks involved. So that's kind of at a high level what the objectives were that we tried to measure. And of course, we ran the experiment over the course of 6 weeks with a lot of time building up and a lot of time analyzing post. And we had certain success criteria that we had in mind for measuring the impact that a platform like this could have on the 4 jurisdictions that participated in the pilot. I hope that's a good kind of conversation starter.
That's a great one. I would say I always like to summarize a little bit and to get some things for the audience. So this is a way for financial institutions to exchange central bank money without intermediaries. I mean, without correspondent banking. And we all know that the corresponding bank is what it's always blamed for the slow and costly process of cross-border payments, right? So, and one important part is for people to know that the settlement is done not in a single currency, but with different pair of currencies that all the countries involved are, right? Is that right?
Yeah, there were transactions that were single currency transactions. So it wasn't distinctly payment versus payment. There were also single payments that were done, but the settlement of a single payment or the settlement of multiple currencies all happened at the same time and on the same type of platform, on the same infrastructure, as opposed to today, every currency will settle in its own system, in its own jurisdiction. So there is this notion of a common settlement platform, and we can maybe discuss the technicalities of that as we go.
That's fine. Thank you, Daniel. Ousmène, now let's turn to Accenture's role in the development and implementation of mBridge, and what kind of expertise did Accenture bring to the project?
No, thank you very much, Coach. And maybe just to add on a point that Daniel mentioned earlier regarding what mBridge is trying to do, and I think it cannot be emphasized enough the fact that mBridge is trying to use local currencies for international payments, and this is something which is still relatively rare. International payments are typically conducted in just a handful of the main currencies, which means there is an enormous dependence on liquidity in these and access to these currencies. And I think where mBridge is really trying to offering something new is this combination of settling in central bank money, being the safest money in any currency area, but in particular using local currencies, so thereby reducing the dependence on the main currencies for conducting payments amongst these participant countries. You have to keep in mind that amongst these countries, typically, most transactions will be settled in the third country currencies, typically the US dollar. So creating the possibility to settle in local currencies is something really new and probably the biggest challenge that mBridge is facing, providing sufficient incentives and efficacy in settling these currencies. So what did Accenture bring to the table? Well, Accenture, you may know, has been, I think it's fair to say, one of the leading consultancies when it comes to the to the adoption of CBDC worldwide. And I think the experience we've had in a number of projects leading up to mBridge, but in particular, the rare chance of having worked on projects that are actual pilots where real transactions were conducted, I think that gave us quite a lot of insights into what are the questions we need to ask participants to get ready really to conduct real transactions. Because mBridge was about real transactions. So it wasn't just a proof of concept. This was, the issuance of real balances or tokens that had real economic value and where banks, participants had to assume real risk. And once you do that, it completely changes the perspective of all the participants. And I think what Accenture was able to do is help guide the discussion, the preparation for what it takes in order to conduct real transactions. That is something I think where we helped support the debate. We did, we were supporting the project management, but also from the strategy side to sort of the readiness of the participants to be able to do these transactions.
That's great,
Ousmène. A summary, Daniel, you.
Thank you, Ousmène. That was a great summary, and the emphasis on how to use local currencies to make the settlement of international or cross-border transactions is exactly what is at the end the most important feature of mBridge. That's thank you for highlighting that once more. So let's go to the next one. Could you explain, you both, could you explain how mBridge works? Specifically, I would like to emphasize a little bit on how to explain the audience a little bit more about what is the asset being settled in the blockchain, which already Ousmène and Daniel already said it's local currencies, which is the asset which is going to be settled. And also who is the issuer, which we already talked a little bit about it, which is the central banks of issuer of each one of those, and how the settlement takes place. Because I guess if we're settling local currencies, then local currencies should be issued in this platform. So I think that's like what we would like to know. So let's start with you, Daniel. Thank you.
Sure, okay. I'll take a swing at it, and then Ousmène will improve my answer, I'm sure. So I like to think about mBridge in 3 layers. At a technical level, I like to think about it in 3 layers. The first layer is the common platform layer. The second layer sitting on top of that is the regional access layer. And then the third layer sitting on top of that are the circulating currencies. So let's build from the bottom up. The common platform layer is anyone that has access directly to the platform. In the context of the pilot and the work that we've done to date, that's central banks and commercial banks and other financial institutions. So it's very much a wholesale access. That base layer provides the settlement certainty that is needed. And that's what I would think of as the distributed ledger that the whole platform sits on top of, okay? On top of that, we have this kind of regional access. The regional access is led by the central bank. The central bank has the authority to extend its own access to its own financial institutions and enable them to have a type of custody, if you would like. So you can imagine there's some images in the mBridge report where the platform is a circle and every region is a quadrant of that circle. Those quadrants can differ with different rules and regulations and requirements all around custody and being able to act on the assets themselves. Okay, so you can think about it, there's a common ledger. On top of that common ledger, there's the ability to have custody of things circulating on that ledger. Those rules and requirements are governed by the central banks themselves. And then on top of that layer, there's the actual CBDC, the actual assets. And the assets themselves can circulate in all of the 4 quadrants, on top of all of the different regional access layers, on top of all of the wallets, so to speak. The central banks themselves are the ones that issue the currency. They can issue it to anyone that has direct access to their RTGS or domestic systems. And those currencies can circulate independently on top of all of that second layer platform, okay? So common settlement, regional access, and then ultimately on top of that, the assets themselves. The role of the central bank are not only onboarders and offboarders of their own regional institutions, they're also currency issuers, and they're also the ones that at the very, very base layer, at the settlement layer, are the ones that are actually writing to the ledger. So it's a consensus amongst those central banks that are writing to the ledger, meaning they finalize and provide settlement finality to the entire platform. And of course, the commercial banks are the ones that request that finality on behalf of payments into that core network of central bank that operates and owns the platform. I think that that's a good kind of maybe technical bird's eye overview of what the platform does. I'll pass it on to Ousmène for additions.
I think mBridge is strictly a payments platform. I think that's also important. It is to conduct just covering the payment side. So while payments may be initiated from sort of the real side, so it could be because of a settlement of international trade or the acquisition of a financial instrument, but it is strictly a payments platform. So in that sense, it is, if you could think about it, it is an interbank clearing platform, but in an international setting where the participants, and we had participants from 4 different jurisdictions, can all use the currencies that are being provided by the 4 participant central banks in order to settle directly peer-to-peer amongst themselves, and allowing to exchange whatever of the 4 currencies is suitable for the particular transaction they are conducting. So it is creating a sort of environment which doesn't really exist today. It doesn't exist today because you cannot settle in central bank money cross-border for one reason, and typically it doesn't exist today because again, many countries do not settle in these local currencies. So in that sense, mBridge does offer a completely new architecture on how to conduct international payments.
That's great. One question that I think that many people, or a few people, could have is, then the bank of jurisdiction A could have on the platform a balance on the currency of country of jurisdiction B.
That's correct.
And it will be registered on the platform, but it will be issued by the central bank of the corresponding jurisdiction, and it will be. I mean, the ledger will. I mean, the balance of each financial institution will be kept on that ledger, and it will remain like having. For the central bank, is having like a reserve account, like having a reserve account from that financial institution from another jurisdiction. Is that right?
I mean, you correct me, but you need to think of it more in terms of what would you do if we were exchanging banknotes, right? The banknotes would be issued by the central banks, but then could be used by all the participants, right? And now banknotes, of course, settle quite differently, but the key notion is there are tokens, so the transfer of the token is basically payment and settlement, in one instance. And that is what we have been doing on the platform as well. So it's not that a national central bank would be conducting transactions on behalf of a foreign commercial banks. No. But a foreign commercial bank would be able to hold the token, similar to holding banknotes, to conduct transactions with any party that has access to the platform. I think that's more how you should look at it.
And that's a good point, because then it's token based and not account based. So the central bank has nothing to do, or has no position on, has no position from any financial institution. It's token based. It's just financial institution holding this different country currency on the platform, and that's it. That was where I was trying to go. It's token based, so central banks do not have like reserve accounts for each one of the financial institutions in the network, but it's just each financial institution having a token, which is a representation of central bank money of different currencies. That's right.
That's correct.
That's right.
So we go to one of the most important parts of mBridge. It's token based, not account based. That's a good clarification.
Maybe we should refine that a little bit, because when we talk about token based versus account based, that's different listeners will interpret that in different ways. So we're not talking about the blockchain itself. In other words, the blockchain, the DLT, can represent liabilities either as accounts with balances or as UTXO input, so unspent transactions. We've experimented with a couple of different versions of these over the history of the project. So mBridge is an extension to a large degree of a project called Inthon Line Rock, which was a combination of 2 other projects in Thailand and in Hong Kong. And in the Inthon Line Rock iterations, we experimented with different distributed ledger technologies, some of them token-based and some of them account-based. The reason I'm emphasizing this, though, is that when you say token and account, you're not talking about the implementation of the blockchain, you're talking more about the accounting structure. The central bank is not holding accounts on behalf of participants, rather it is enabling a tokenized version of their liability through a DLT platform to be held directly by the participants. I just want to make sure that that point is clear. Maybe to add on to that as well, interesting in the scenario that you described, a foreign commercial bank holding the liability of a commercial bank holding the liability of a foreign central bank. That commercial bank doesn't have issuance and redemption capacity with the issuer themselves because they don't have a reserve account with the issuer. So that's a nuanced point, but when you think about the pilot and the experiments and some of the limitations that puts on that commercial bank, it can effectively only be used for payments, and it can only be redeemed once those tokens circulate back to a commercial bank in the jurisdiction that actually has an account with the issuer.
Those are great points to have clear.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, maybe just to illustrate the life cycle of the token. So Daniel to some extent already explained it, but so commercial banks that are resident in the jurisdiction of a central bank, so typically of their national central bank, they will acquire CBDC in exchange of reserves. Okay, and they can redeem CBDC in exchange of reserves. So only central banks, only commercial banks that have an account with a central bank can perform these transactions. But once the token is in circulation, it can be exchanged freely between all participants. Yeah. So again, the parallel with the banknote, I think, is quite fitting. Redemption and issuance can only be performed by national commercial banks, but the tokens can circulate amongst national and foreign commercial banks.
Thank you, Ousmène and Daniel. I think that makes the point of how the issuance and the distribution at the end of the token takes place. Thank you. So let's go to the next one, and it has to do with the blockchain technology. As I mentioned before, the mBridge is based on a blockchain custom designed and developed by central banks for central banks. Can you explain which are the main differences with a customary blockchain? Ousmène, let's go with you first.
When you say customer, you mean a public blockchain, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the main difference, of course, with the public chain is the public chain, of course, is an existing financial market infrastructure that, in theory, you could readily use to deploy your tokens, on that chain. The disadvantage is that, of course, everyone has access to it, and central banks they would want to limit who can have access to their tokens, but also who should be participating in the validation of transactions underlying their tokens. And that is why there is a preference so far among central banks to use private chains. So there is a trade-off between, say, the readiness that a public chain would offer, but then in terms of privacy, probably also throughput and scalability and performance, where private chain offer a considerable advantages. So mBridge is based effectively on a private chain approach in that sense.
And maybe I can strengthen some of the points there as well. The often kind of binary distinction between public and private is to me a little bit misleading because it's not completely binary. I think when we think about public permissionless chains, which Ousmène described well, that is one type of existing financial market infrastructure that have a certain role and limitations. If we remove that, it doesn't mean that we are automatically in some type of very constrained private permissioned world, right? We're just not in a totally open permissionless setting, right? There are varying degrees of how private or how permissioned these chains can be. So it's just not completely open. And I think for good reason, right? If you think of the public permissionless world, public means anybody can participate as a user. Permissionless means anybody can contribute to the consensus mechanism. That is likely not the world where wholesale institutional payments will live. It doesn't mean that it is, super constrained, but it's constrained more than being completely open and public. The other thing that I think is maybe worth talking about in this question about a blockchain built by central banks for central banks, I think one thing that's probably worth thinking about is sovereignty and autonomy of these type of solutions. So when we look at, these type of, critical infrastructure payment systems, there's a certain degree of sovereignty that central banks and these institutions need to be able to have in order to have the confidence to issue their liabilities onto, specifically to issue their CBDC onto, where it can be carried offshore to third parties and so on and so forth. So it really boils down to, who owns the intellectual property, who is able to operate on these things if things goes wrong, what are backup and resilience arrangements look like, things like that. So it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but when you look at kind of dependencies that central banks will create on payment service providers, that's a very nuanced conversation to have. So one of the things that I think mBridge kind of spearheaded is this idea of, can central banks actually, to some degree, facilitate this in a way that is a little bit more sovereign than bringing in private sector service providers and gluing them all together and maybe not really having a deep understanding of what's going on underneath the hood, and definitely not owning the intellectual property associated with the technology that's powering these platforms. So this is probably one of the biggest attempts at doing exactly that.
That's really interesting, Daniel. Thank you very much. And Ousmène, thank you very much for this. Next one. Can you share the results of Project mBridge pilot in terms of transaction volume, speed, cost effectiveness? And what are your thoughts about how do they compare with existing cross-border payments and settlement solutions? Let's go with you, Daniel, first.
Sure. Okay, so by virtue of putting the platform in a real world environment, we couldn't wave our magic wand and say, okay, let's do as much transactions as possible and do all kinds of crazy simulations, because at the end of the day, these were real payments. This was real money. So it had to, as Ousmène said, this is a payment platform. It needed to tie into a use case. So the use case that we looked at was settlement for trade and trade finance oriented transactions. So to some degree, it was limited by, well, what's the volume of trade and what are the existing banking relationships and who's buying from who and what. So I would put the outcome of the pilot, and I think that this is well explained in the paper, that in a way, putting a platform in a real world setting can teach you a lot about constraints and considerations that you may not have had, but it also reduces the freedom to think up any experiment you want and conduct it in the real world. So we didn't focus, the experiment wasn't focused on volume and speed and things like that per se, because that's more like a lab type of environment. Here we put it in the real world and said, will the commercial banks actually be able to tie this into their systems, request CBDC from their central banks, use the CBDC for settlement of real transactions, and what things will arise from that. One of the things that we looked at was, we brought 20 commercial banks together, 5 from each jurisdiction, and we wanted to look at what number of bilateral connections can be made over the course of the 6 weeks to strengthen the connectivity between these commercial banks. So in other words, if we think about peer-to-peer relationships, the ideal state is that every commercial bank is connected to every other commercial bank. And I would believe that if we had enough time and we had a platform like this in the real world, very quickly we would reach a threshold where all the commercial banks would interact with all the commercial banks because they would be able to. The pilot was limited in scope for 6 weeks. Some of the commercial banks transacted with commercial banks that they already had been transacting with. But what we did see was there was a growth of relationships. So overall, we looked at the map of the relationships of the banks, and we enacted 42 different bilateral corridors between the 20 commercial banks. It's important to note that the commercial banks in each jurisdiction did not interact with each other. So every group of 5 commercial banks could interact with the other 15, not with the 5 domestically. So when we look at the map of the pilot, there were 42 bilateral cross-border corridors that were enacted. The maximum number is 180 if you look at the full graph. So there's still ways to go in creating more connections, but that was already more than the existing correspondent banking relationships that were in place. So we were able to kind of grow the strength of that bilateral connectivity. The settlement times in general were relatively instant. There is no such thing as instant in distributed systems, but the transactions settle immediately. The payment message and the settlement happen in one transaction atomically. So it is a matter of it's a handful of seconds as opposed to, you know, correspondent banking chains. And over the course of the 6 weeks, there were roughly 160 different payments, including payment versus payment transactions and one-way payments for settlement of trade oriented use cases. So those are kind of the statistics around what we measured as an outcome of the pilot. Ousmène, maybe over to you for any additions.
Yeah, I think what is important, something that we wanted to do in mBridge were the payments versus payments and transactions. And this is a way of transacting for foreign exchange in particular, which mitigates greatly the so-called settlement risk. That is one of the predominant risks in foreign exchange markets. And there is just as background, but there is a fundamental concern that the proportion of payments that are settled on a payments versus payments basis has been shrinking for quite a number of years now, and is today lower than 40% for all foreign exchange transactions that are being conducted, which means that risks in the foreign exchange market are increasing to the extent that settlement risk is not being mitigated. And mBridge, I think, provided a great example of how payments versus payments transactions could be conducted very, very efficiently, peer-to-peer, where the payment is the settlement. So while even conventionally today, if you think about payments versus payments transactions being settled by, for example, CLS Bank in New York or CHATS in Hong Kong, they're huge. There are long delays between the trade execution, the funding, trade execution, and settlement of the trade. In mBridge, all of this was done instantaneously, and this is where, again, I think mBridge is projecting this new approach to how these payments can be conducted, which in essence should provide for a much more efficient, safer, and also to some extent transactions requiring far less regulatory capital than in the current environment. That, to some extent, for me, I think for Accenture was one of the big contributions, demonstrating, how we could change and make these payments far more effective.
That's really interesting, Ousmène and Daniel. And I would like to highlight something that FNA, we work at networks. FNA stands for Financial Network Analytics. And I think that one great way for you to measure the success, as Daniel pointed out, is how you are changing the shape of the cross-border networks. If you use correspondent banking, obviously it will be a rather centralized network. If you're using a solution like the one we have here at mBridge, it should be at the end, as you, Daniel, mentioned, with enough time, it should be like a complete network in which you have everyone being able to interact to each other. So that's really interesting from the point of the resilience of the network, obviously. So that's something very interesting because, in network literature, it's very hard to find good examples of complete networks arising naturally. It's not very easy to find those in real world networks, let's call it like this, unless you have many clients asking their financial institutions to send money to other financial institutions. So there is no relationship banking, but it's just fulfilling the orders. And that's really interesting because you're making these cross-border networks more resilient just because everyone is able to connect to each other without an intermediary. And that's really nice from the network analytics point of view. And that's something that I would like to highlight from our side of financial network analytics. So thank you for this, Ousmène and Daniel.
And Carlos, maybe just to illustrate for the listeners to appreciate that a typical transaction, an international payments transaction, is going along, what could be a fairly long payment chain. It could be a number of different institutions, which means between the two trading parties or the end beneficiaries of the transactions, it's a long chain of institutions. And the idea here is to make this as direct as sending an email from end beneficiary to end beneficiary. You see, so it is a completely new way of how these transactions could be conducted. It would be similar to sending, you pack your banknotes effectively in an envelope and send them by mail to the recipient. But you do it in the digital space. That is how the transactions are being conducted in the on the base of the mBridge model.
Thank you, man. Let's go to the next one. We're running a little bit late, and that means that we're discussing some very interesting things. Next one is, how does Project mBridge handle cross-border regulatory compliance and ensure that all participants are following relevant laws and regulations? Let's go with you, Daniel.
Sure. I think the key phrase there is the relevant laws and regulations. I think it really, when you're working in a multi-jurisdictional environment, the regulatory considerations and laws will change depending on the jurisdiction. I think there's still a lot of work to do with this respect, but some of the conscious attempts that we made with the architecture was to really distill down that core platform to a very, very small set of features, mostly centered around providing settlement for any institution on top of the platform that has access. The regional layer that we described, we tried to create as modular as possible so that regional access layer, sponsored by each central bank, would be able to facilitate the regional requirements and legal constructs. So layer 0 is almost agnostic to any regulation. All it does is provide settlement for the layer above it. And then in the custody layer that's provisioned in this regional way, you have rules around that are completely modular. And likewise, in the currencies themselves, you can have rules that are actually, in a word that I'm hesitant to use, but in a smart contract-like form, you're able to take those rules and move them around independent of which region you are in. So a good example of that would be, you can have on this kind of agnostic settlement platform, a region that says, you are only allowed to operate on this platform, let's say in open RTGS hours, but let's say that's a constraint on transactions at a custodial level. But on top of that, you could say, I'm going to issue a token that can circulate in this region and in others that will be limited, let's say, to a certain dollar value, or limited to a certain time, or limited to a certain number of transactions per day. So, creating a type of modular Lego brick-like approach, I think enabled us to capture the ability to enforce rules, but also the ability for it to be modular and to respect each jurisdiction's sovereignty and regulatory requirements, all while providing at that base layer the common settlement platform that is really the essence of the project.
To add here, I think regulation. I mean, you put the emphasis on regulation. Regulation may be the biggest obstacle for improving international payments, and there is a tension undoubtedly between agreeing on a common set of regulation for all participants and leaving regulation to the jurisdiction of the participants, and that tension. I think it's fair to say that mBridge has not quite found a solution to where is the optimal sort of point to accommodate that tension. But I think on the one hand there will be an ambitious project which will say, similar to a scheme, you participate on the platform and thereby you are bound by the rules of that platform, which should incorporate as well the notion of when settlement finality is being reached. While there may be other approaches where all of that will remain in the national jurisdictions, and therefore there may be, in the event of an exchange, uncertainty of whether both sides simultaneously truly can accommodate a settlement finality or not. You see, so I think as we move forward, different countries may decide different approaches, how to, in what direction they go between this tension.
Very interesting, Ousmène and Daniel. Let's go to the next one. How does Project mBridge compare to other cross-border payment solutions currently available in the market?
Ousmène, why don't you take that?
Well, it's difficult to. What are the other solutions? Right, we have the existing, correspondent banking network, right, which is basically a huge arrangement of bilateral relationship. You can't really say it's a cross-border solution in that sense. So there isn't anything like mBridge, I think, today. Is fair to say. You could think of, because mBridge is this this unique combination between central banks and commercial banks sharing a common platform. Okay, so this is something which doesn't really exist today. We have central banks sharing a common platform, but there are very few examples. I mean, you could think of maybe the liquidity swap lines between the Fed and other central banks. You could think of the SDR network at the IMF, but there's nothing really where central banks and commercial banks share something in common. So in that sense, I think there isn't really anything like it. And that is also the contribution of mBridge, namely to provide, you see, a completely new approach on how international payments could be conducted.
I'll take that answer.
Thank you, man. Okay, let's leave it like that. Next one, and that's the last one before we turn to the attendance question. What is next for mBridge, and how does it fit into the broader landscape of fintech and blockchain innovation? Okay, Daniel, let's go with you first.
Sure. I think there's a couple of different vectors that are next for mBridge, and they're all to some degree independent of each other. In terms of running bigger and better pilots, I think that's definitely on the agenda. More jurisdictions, maybe more sophisticated use cases, more volume, things like that. So a wider time window, more jurisdictions, maybe also extending it past very, very large commercial banks, maybe also going into smaller banks, things like that. So we can look at simulating the mBridge platform in real world environment. Sorry, I shouldn't say simulating, running pilots in the real world environment with a broader scope and a bigger agenda. Another vector that we're looking at is also looking at taking the existing kind of core membership of mBridge and seeing if we can move closer to production. That would mean looking mostly at the legal and regulatory constructs, the issuance constructs, things of that nature, so that we could operate in a real world setting, things like cyber resiliency and things that are, I would think of as non-functional to start, but are incredibly important when we start thinking of a production system that can happen. And then the other component of it is also on a technical level, more technical deepening from all of the project participants. So what this could mean would be domestic deployments in each jurisdiction that would operate the platform, for example. So not having to depend on any technical infrastructure that sits outside of the jurisdictions participating, potentially extending the functionality of the platform at a technical level. So central banks as issuers or commercial banks as users, integrating it closer into their system, maybe contributing smart contracts and functionality into the code base, things like that. So providing more technical depth around both hosting, deployment, and operational functions, but also extending the actual applications of the platform is also something that we would like to explore with more as we proceed. So maybe I'll bring this back to this central banks for central banks. The code base of mBridge is open to the participants, and the participants can not only see it, but can also extend it. So there's definitely an inspiration that is coming from the public permissionless blockchain world into the permissioned world of central banks and financial institutions.
Thank you, Daniel. Ousmène.
Just to extend, I think it's key for mBridge is to provide some governance and greater regulatory certainty. I think that there would have to be some sort of arrangement that works for most participants. And I think looking forward, if mBridge were to represent truly an alternative to international payments, then it must demonstrate that there are sufficient incentives for actually settling in local currency, as we said at the beginning. What are the conditions necessary for these currencies to have adequate liquidity so that settlement can actually take place there? Let's not forget, for example, when it comes to foreign exchange rates, typically these do not exist between the 4 participant currencies we have been working with. So we have to go via crosses. So can mBridge provide an environment where eventually we have direct prices, direct exchange rates between these currencies? I think this is where one of the biggest challenges will lie, and that will ultimately decide whether such a platform provides sufficient incentives for commercial banks wanting to participate in that.
Thank you, Ousmène and Daniel. That was like my set of questions. I'm going to turn into the questions from the audience. And as usual, I'll have to make this exercise of squeezing many questions into just a couple of them. First one is, do you foresee mBridge becoming something that would scale to a more regional? I mean, it's 4 countries right now. Could you see it like scaling to tens of countries, or perhaps continents, or perhaps the whole globe? Is something that you foresee happening? I don't know who wants to start.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a swing at it. I think the answer, my perspective is absolutely. I think the interesting thing is going to be, I think I'm hesitant to say that there will be one platform for all the regions, but I could see regional platforms developing at their own speed and pace, and then some type of interoperability arrangement happening at these regional levels. I think I saw a question in the chat as well about differences between Dunbar and Ubin and things like that. One, it's interesting that both Dunbar and mBridge, and I can talk about the differences between them, but just on this note that you're asking, Carlos, 4 participants, in my opinion, is kind of the perfect amount of participants to get some type of generalization without too much overhead on, crazy governance arrangements and things like that. I think it's going to be interesting for us to see, as the number of participants scale, how heavy that governance role is, to what degree it's distributed, to what degree it's centralized, how does it split up between the different layers. But I can anticipate there being an emergence of many regional platforms, and then some layer of interoperability between them in the future.
Just I think we shouldn't aim for one big platform. On the contrary, I think it is the flexibility we want, and many different platforms to coexist. I think this is also how financial innovation will continue to drive forward. Namely, if we do not require to agree all on a common standard or on a common platform. So hopefully there may be a coexistence of many different initiatives, of which something like mBridge may be one of the dominant. But I don't think the ambition should be to span the entire world.
And it's very interesting that you both go the same way, because once again, going to my field of expertise, which is network analytics at the end, normally you would say that a fully connected network of all financial institutions in the world could make the system rather fragile in some sense, because everyone is connected to everyone else, and that could make like some problem to reverberate into the entire network. That's very financial networks analysis and theory at the end. So having these like clusters or groups or regions of different mBridges for different regions, it makes sense from that viewpoint. And it's very interesting that you both went exactly the same way. That's really interesting for the, let's call it, for the resilience of the payment system. And
we've spent too much time together, most likely.
You're already synchronized, and that's something that it happens when you work a lot, right? And the other question that I'm trying to squeeze from the audience is, what will be the impact in the following 3 topics: SWIFT, CLS, and the role of the US dollar?
Ousmène, I'll let you take that.
Okay, SWIFT. Yes, I think look, SWIFT is very much the old world, right? It's, as you know, it's a messaging system, so it doesn't even transmit value. What we're trying in mBridge is we combine, handshake and value, right? The idea is to merge data and messaging into one. So I think to some extent, it doesn't mean, SWIFT could be very effective for certain types of applications, but I think there will be many where an approach like mBridge will be superior. CLS Bank, well, in a peer-to-peer exchange of central bank monies, surely mBridge will be far superior to CLS. So I think CLS could be one of the big losers in an environment where we have peer-to-peer, principal-for-principal exchanges of central bank money. When it comes to the US dollar, well, what I said at the end of our sort of moderated Q&A, it will be up to mBridge to demonstrate whether it can provide sufficient liquidity for its currencies to really be attractive. The dollar is obviously such an attractive currency because it is so liquid and an entire institutional setup around it. That will be something that mBridge will have to replicate, or the individual currencies would have to be, and that would be a big challenge. So I think it'll be some time for the dollar to really lose in importance, I think.
Yeah.
Daniel, you couldn't escape this.
I largely agree, but I'll highlight where I maybe disagree. I don't think SWIFT should be seen as at odds necessarily with an mBridge-like platform, to the extent that the global phone book that SWIFT provides can be an input into not just maybe a messaging, but also a clearing and settlement platform like mBridge. I think to some extent SWIFT could also integrate. If platforms like mBridge provide that addressing service, maybe they would surpass SWIFT at some point, but in general sense, I don't see them completely at odds with each other. Maybe there's room there for coordination and cooperation. On the CLS side, I mean, of course, CLS only supports a limited number of currencies. That's mostly because the markets don't exist for the other currencies. I would think that mBridge could provide currency pairs between any currencies and PVP protection for any currencies. Of course, contingent that the market is actually there. I think the one challenge for an mBridge-like platform versus a CLS platform is, of course, the netting and the liquidity requirements that are needed. So there's a very different approach when you think about CLS netting and how efficient that is versus what are the liquidity requirements, and if netting exists at all in these CBDC worlds. And then I largely agree with what Ousmène said about the US dollar. More diversity in payments, I think, would generally be well received to the global audience. But of course, it's a lot more than just the technology. mBridge is a technology platform. The role of the US dollar is much broader than just the technology that it's on.
Thank you, Daniel and Ousmène. That's a wrap. We're finishing our CBDC broadcast. I had to leave a lot of questions aside. I'm sorry for that. But I think that we covered a lot of topics, a lot of very interesting issues and very interesting concerns. So I thank you both once again, Daniel and Ousmène, for joining us in the CBDC broadcast. So if you want to get in touch with Ousmène or with Daniel, we're going to leave their link profiles in the presentation that we're going to distribute to everyone else. And I would like to highlight that coming in March, we'll have 3 different broadcasts. The Subted broadcast number 4 with Accenture and Oliver Wyman, the FMI broadcast number 9 with University of Cambridge and Onyx by JP Morgan, and CBDC broadcast number 15 with the Digital Dollar Project and MIT. So once again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, Daniel and Ousmène.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.